Dan Geltrude, Geltrude and Company founder, joining us here today. Okay, Dan, what is the top mistake that you see most frequently?
So there's really three of them, Brad, right? And they're so easy and so avoidable, yet they happen all the time. First of all, people end up putting down the wrong social security number. Primarily, they'll transpose numbers. That's the first thing. The second thing is they make a mistake related to their filing status. They may be married and they put single instead. No good. And the last thing here is that the information on the return is actually incomplete. Specifically, people have a tendency to forget about some of those 1099s that they got, or they lost them. But any of those three items is going to bring attention to your tax return. And one of the keys about filing your tax return is you don't want to hear from the IRS. You don't want to invite them to the party. And when you make these common mistakes, you're sending that big old invitation right over to them.
Okay, so how can people make sure that they don't make these mistakes and avoid these pitfalls? What are some of the checks, the balances that they can put in place?
Well, the first thing to do is to check your current year tax return against last year. See, if you got your tax return right last year, well, that's a good model to follow to make sure that you didn't make any of those mistakes. Second thing is you want to make sure that you're properly organized with all your tax documents to make sure that you're not going to misplace anything. And the other thing is to make sure you review your tax return very, very carefully before you actually submit it.
Dan, what happens when you file your tax return and you owe, but perhaps can't afford to pay immediately?
Well, that's a big uh-oh, right, Brad? So listen, the first thing that people think is, oh no, I don't have enough to pay my tax bill. I'm not going to file my tax return. Wrong answer. File the tax return, make whatever payment you can, and even if you can't make any payment, file it anyway, because it's all about reducing the potential for penalties for non-filing. Then the next thing to do is look at Form 9465, which is an installment agreement. In other words, try to work out a payment plan with the IRS to get those taxes paid. And then the last thing is what's called an offer in compromise. And that's where you make a lump sum payment for some lesser amount to try to call it even Steven with the IRS.
What about for gig workers out there, Dan? I mean, there have been so many changes within the last year, and I know we're specifically looking at 2023 here as people are filing. Are there significant changes that gig workers should be on the lookout for and how they're filing?
Well, not necessarily changes, but one thing that's overlooked, Brad, is that when you have these gig workers who are receiving 1099s in terms of working as an independent contractor, you don't necessarily have to just put that number on your tax return. You can go to what's called a Schedule C, which is basically the equivalent of having your own business. And by setting it up that way, Brad, you are able to take deductions for any expenses that you have related to generating that income. So what you want to do is make sure that you maintain all the documents related to having expenses for that gig that you have running. That way you can get the benefit of deductions you normally wouldn't get as a W-2 employee.
Dan, how far are we away from generative AI just absolutely changing the entire landscape of filing these tax returns and going through the year in, year out duty and making sure that you're getting your refund, or making sure that you're just allocating for what maybe you didn't pay over the course of the year and have to declare as well?
Well, we're kind of there now. I mean, with the advancement of the tax preparation programs in terms of just being able to comply with filing your tax return, yeah, I mean, it's going to go further and further down that road. Where the benefit comes in terms of having human involvement is related to the strategy. How do you legally minimize how much tax you pay? And I don't think that we're there with AI right now. Is that something way down the road? Sure, that's possible. But in terms of compliance, there's a lot out there already.
Dan, always a pleasure to get some time with you. Thanks so much for joining us here on Wealth. Dan Geltrude, who's the Geltrude & Company founder.